Well, welcome everyone to another Grail sense-making series event. And one of the things that we've been focusing on quite a bit is just the way that AI is changing entire sectors of society. And certainly education is not going to be immune from that, whether it is a byproduct of core capabilities of AI or a byproduct of the enormous venture dollars that are thrown into the landscape that's going to terraform some educational policies. We don't know. So the question is it the aspect of AI itself and what it does, or is it more how we begin to orient toward the prospect of AI that we're contending with? And so one of the things we wanted to do was to get a series of lectures initiated on what this looks like and what do we need to see, because it's a conversation, not a pontification that needs to occur around the AI topics. And so we've had a number of events going on that are trying to unpack this. We just last week, some of you may have been in Denver at the event that we hosted, where we got together with a group of leaders and just talked about what's going on AI practically on the ground. We held an event in Dallas in March. We held one in June in Singapore. We have a few others that will sort of unpack as the year goes. And if anyone's interested in hosting, just let Grace Lynch or myself know, and we can unpack it from there. But the whole point is AI and understanding AI is a conversation. And we need to get into that conversation as well as we can in order to basically meet the needs of our students as impactfully and as effectively as we can. One of the things we did is we created GRAIL, a Global Research Alliance for AI and Learning and Education. Came out of and I'll share this link shortly, came out of the Empowering Learners Conference we've run for 4 years now. We really wanted to focus on AI research turned into practice, so real applicable positive impact in education. We also want to give leadership some guidelines on what this looks like. How do you support leadership in deploying AI initiatives? And how do you create a space for capacity development, such as what we're doing here? How do you create a space for a sense-making forum that's globally informed rather than sort of, USA out, because that's where a lot of the hub of Western AI technology is emerging. So how do we all get into the conversation? And then a bigger question that's coming out of Power and Prediction is, what's this look like? Like, there's a point-based solution where we use AI to solve a problem. There's an application solution where we use AI to help us improve parts of the system. And then there's the significant systems change, which many in education have been looking for many years in general. But I think that's the kind of thing we're trying to unpack with this. We've just secured a Gates Foundation grant where we'll be doing some AI literacy development for free resources and modules that'll be publicly available as well. And we'll share that as that gets a little further along. I'll drop a few links in for people that want to stay current in the conversation and so on. But with that as a starting point, I'm just going to turn it over to our guest speaker today. One of the things we're fortunate of is that there's quite a bit of work that's been going on from a lot of individuals in a lot of related areas to be quite actively involved in what's going on in the entire education landscape. And so as a result of that, we've reached out to voices and perspectives globally, people from different regions who have insight into what's going on in the education landscape. And I think we're really fortunate to have Mike Sharples spend some time thinking through some of these details with us today. Mike's been very active in the ed tech space, in a number of settings, from BBC to Open University to Open Learning, and has long been a leader in sort of promoting and evaluating what's happening, but through a very research-informed and, for lack of a better word, a very human perspective. So I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, Mike. I'm going to throw it over to you. If anybody's asking questions, I'll track those in the discussion forums. So, Mike, welcome.
That's great. Thank you very much for the introduction, George. And it's good to be here with you. Sorry I can't be here in person, but I'm going to leave some time for questions at the end. As George said, I've been active in education technology, but I guess the main reason I'm here today is that my PhD was on AI and creative writing. And now 40 years later, that's come back to bite me. So George says that AI is a conversation, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. That's going to be the main theme of my talk today. So let me share the screen. And I hope you could see that. And the title is A New Science of Learning with AI. So let me just start off by what I mean by a science of learning. So a seminal paper written by Andy Meltzoff and colleagues in 2009, published in the journal Science, describes a science of learning in which insights from many different fields are converging to create a new science of learning that may transform educational practice. And that paper said the themes were from psychology, from neuroscience, from machine learning, from education. And they're all combining to give us a deeper and greater understanding of how people learn and how we can teach effectively. And now we have a new disruptor, if you like, a new science of learning with generative AI. AI is disrupting education. Is it a threat to education? Is it a universal tutor? I want to try and get below some of those headlines, but it does require us to rethink teaching, learning, and assessment for an era where humans and machines engage in extended dialogues, in extended conversations. So just so that we're all on the same page, I'm going to just give you a kind of update on the best known of the large language models, GPT-4. And as many of you know, it's a highly trained text completer and style copier. It has a context window of 25,000 words, which means it can summarize a very large document, or if you give it a prompt, an instruction, then it could generate up to an entire undergraduate dissertation. It can write in any style, in multiple languages. It can be given a direct instruction, and it can interpret text and images. And you can see there on the right-hand side, the users said, answer question 1.1a, think step by step, and then includes an exam question written in French with an illustration. And GPT-4 can now not only interpret the French exam question, but also interpret the illustration to answer that question. So it can interpret text and images. It's a general purpose language tool. And a new extension to GPT, ChatGPT Plus, has plugins for maths, science, language, media, business. So it's extending that basic language functionality. It has an integration now with a web browser, so you can ask it for up-to-date information. So I put in, for example, which tech companies are likely to perform well in the near future. And it came back with, based on the latest information I found, here are a few tech companies, listed those tech companies, but also gave links to the web pages where that information was found. So it can link now to specific web pages. And this may sound geeky, but there's also a code interpreter that can run and display Python programs. And what that means is, for example, you could give it a large database and just say, run some basic visualizations, and the Python interpreter can then interpret that database and produce scatter plots, histograms, and so on. So it's not only a powerful language model now, but it's been extended to be a web browser, a code interpreter, and to allow plugins. But as I'm sure many of you have heard, generative AI hallucinates. It doesn't know, for example, that it shouldn't invent research studies. It has no inbuilt explicit model of how the world works. It has no explicit database of the functioning of the dynamics of the world. And in human terms, it's amoral. It's a language model. It's not a database or a reasoning system, and it's wrong to describe it as a database or a reasoning system. And the OpenAI company, which developed GPT-4, is quite explicit about that. Here's a quote from one of its blogs. From hallucinating inaccurate information to offensive outputs to bias and much more, language models may not be suitable for every use case without significant modifications. Now, the company has modified the basic model. It's given it additional training by humans so that the outputs from the GPT-4 model is then assessed as to whether it meets certain standards of language, of bias, and of accuracy. So about a year ago, I started on a small experiment asking various versions of GPT to write a student essay. So I gave it a prompt. You're a student on a Master of Education course. Write a high-quality 500-word essay on a critique of learning styles. The essay should include academic references and evidence from research studies. It should begin, the construct of learning styles is problematic because, and then I press the submit button. And within a few seconds, it came back with a student essay. And over the last year, I've been trying that with successive versions of GPT. Well, in November 2022, when ChatGPT was first released, I tried that again. So I gave it the prompt, and this is what it came back with. It looks on the surface like an undergraduate essay. It has paragraphs. It has a beginning, a middle, an end, in conclusion. It has references, citations, references in neat APA format. And when you read it, it looks like a moderately good student essay. But then right in the middle of it, there's this sentence. In tracking, learners are sorted into groups based on their perceived learning style, which can reinforce stereotypes and limit opportunities for growth and exploration. Gurung 2004. Well, I went to search for Gurung 2004, and there is no research study by Gurung 2004. That research study was entirely invented. And so was the reference at the end, Gurung 2004, Black and White Thinking About Learning Styles. There is a Journal of College Reading and Learning, but no paper from Gurung 2004 in that journal. So why should the language model GPT-4 invent a research study? The short answer is because we ask it to. It is a text completer, a text continuer. So when it gets to lead to harmful practices such as tracking and labeling students, it tries to find appropriate text that would fit into that context. And if it can't find text describing an actual research study, then it will make one up. It will invent one. It will produce plausible text. So that's the problem with it. It is a language model. You can't assume that it's going to provide accurate information. However, I tried it again in March 2023 with GPT-4, and this is what it produced. Every single reference there is accurate, correct, and reading it, I would be happy if a student submitted that as an undergraduate assignment. It's got all the right referencing. It's a short student essay. It covers the right ground. It's coherent. It's accurate. So there is a huge difference between GPT-3, which is the basis for ChatGPT, the free version, and GPT-4. And I would urge you that if you're saying GPT can't do this or GPT can do that, say which version it is that you're talking about, because there's a huge difference between GPT-3 and GPT-4. Can you detect whether a language model is, whether a piece of text is produced by an AI language model or by a human? Well, the short answer is no. Firstly, traditional plagiarism detectors don't work because the text is generated, it's not copied. There isn't an original source that you can look back on to say this has been plagiarized. There is a new breed of AI-based detectors, but they work in a very different way from plagiarism detectors. They are essentially pattern recognizers. And the basic principle behind them is that AI language models have produce a more uniform text with less variation, whereas humans tend to vary their text. They use some unusual or exceptional phrases. And so AI detectors look for how uniform or how unusual that text is. OpenAI itself have produced a AI-based detector tool really just to show whether it's possible or not and how accurate it is. And that labels 9% of human written text as written by AI. In other words, if you had 10 student written essays, all written by a real human student, 1 in 10 of those would be misclassified as being written by AI, 1 in 10 false positives. The Turnitin company, which is the best known of the AI, of the plagiarism detection companies, has its own AI detector, and they claim less than 1% false positives, so less than 1 in 100. However, that was tested with GPT 3.5, and as we've seen, there's a big difference between GPT 3 or 3.5 and GPT 4, and it was based on data that was collected in a controlled lab environment, and those claims need to be independently verified. But perhaps the nail in the coffin for AI detectors is a recent paper came out just 2 weeks ago, which shows that AI detectors are more likely to misclassify the text of non-native English writers. And that's not surprising, because non-native English writers have a more limited vocabulary, so they tend to write in a more uniform style, which means that the detectors are more likely to misclassify them as being AI writers. So GPT and other detectors are more likely to misclassify the text of non-native English writers. So there's a problem. And what should institutions do? Well, there's basically 4 approaches. You can ban AI systems, as New York City schools did, for example. But that kind of opens up a new digital divide, which is that the confident students will continue to use AI. And if they're challenged by the institution, will say, prove it. And the institution won't be able to, except to say, my AI detector suggests that you're using an AI generator, and you're pitting an AI detector against an AI generator. And the less confident students will be put off using any sort of tools and assistants, such as style checkers or machine translators. So you're opening up a new digital divide. You could evade by going back to invigilated exams, but these are costly and limited. You could ask students to state when they use AI, but that will become increasingly difficult because AI generators will be, and already becoming, embedded into the everyday office tools we use, such as Microsoft Word. There will just be a continue button that will, you press that and it will generate the next sentence or the next paragraph for you. Most universities, schools, colleges are taking the adapt route, but that requires new methods of assessment, new policies and guidelines. And a few, such as the state of Singapore, are embracing generative AI. Singapore is open to ChatGPT use in schools, but urges caution that you have to use it with care, as I'll come back to, and it involves a long process of building trust. But at this point, I want to flip the narrative away from how will AI impact education to what are new and effective ways to teach and learn with AI. So I want to focus on the new ways of teaching and learning with generative AI. And a few years ago, I wrote a book called Practical Pedagogy, 40 New Ways to Teach and Learn. It was based on a series of reports from the Open University called Innovating Pedagogy. And I collected 40 of those and expanded them for this book. And a few weeks ago, I went back to those 40 pedagogies and asked myself, could any of them be augmented by AI? And to my surprise, every one of them that I looked at, citizen inquiry, computational thinking, translanguaging, teachback, every one of them could be enhanced through generative AI. So I'm going to give you some examples. So here's one example. I've given it evocative name. So this one, possibility engine. So with a possibility engine, the educator or the student uses AI to generate multiple responses to an open question. So they start with an open question. So here's one from an exam paper on international relations. In what way is Marxist theorizing still relevant to international relations? And then you press the submit button and it comes back with an answer. Every time you ask it, every time you prompt it, it comes back with a different response. And you can also try changing the prompt. So to say, does Marxist theorizing still have relevance to international relations? And one trick for prompt engineering, is to say, show how you arrive at your conclusions. If you add that at the end, generally it produces a longer response and a better response. So the idea is then the educator or the student generates multiple responses to an open question, and then the students synthesize and critique those AI responses to produce their own written answer based on the contributions of the AI. One that I particularly like is a Socratic Opponent. So the students engage with ChatGPT or other language model in a Socratic dialogue to explore an argument or to prepare for a debate, because we want students to be good at argumentation and debate, and bouncing ideas off a language model is one good way to do that. So in this example here, I asked it to compare US and Chinese economic models and say which is more likely to be successful in the short to medium term, the US or the Chinese economic model. And it came back with the US model is likely to be more successful because China has struggled with corruption and unequal distribution of wealth. So I pushed back and said, well, yes, but the US has also struggled with corruption and unequal distribution of wealth. So maybe China's command economy will be more successful. And I had a debate with the AI model. It's interesting that I found that it seemed to develop a persona as I went through that debate and similar debates of a kind of woolly liberal American persona. And I guess that's not surprising because it's trained on the internet. Much of the internet is from the US, and also it's had this additional training. And that additional training has been directed, managed by woolly liberal US academics and computer scientists. So it's interesting to see the emerging persona of these language models. And the last one I want to show you just for now is as a personal tutor. So I've got a background in AI. I spent 10 years developing a tutoring system for radiology. And it was a very difficult and demanding project. So I wanted to test whether an AI language model could act as a tutor. So I asked it to tutor me on quantum computing. I genuinely wanted to know about quantum computing. And so I said, you are an expert tutor in computing. I'm an undergraduate student. I want you to tutor me in quantum computing. You should assume I have no initial knowledge of the topic. You should tutor through a dialogue with me, continually assessing my current state of knowledge through appropriate questions. When I ask, you should provide a summary of my knowledge of quantum computing that I can give to my professor. Is that clear? And it came back with, yes, that's clear. Let's begin. It asked me if I understood classical computing and what a bit is. I said yes. And then it went on to tutor me in quantum computing. And I must say, I was impressed. Not only did it tutor at the right level of my understanding, but also I could interrupt it. I could ask it to go into greater depth about an area, such as quantum entanglement. I even offered it an analogy of the quantum entanglement of two clocks that were separated, and you knew that if you looked at one clock, the other clock would show the same time. Is that a good analogy? And it commented on my analogy. So it didn't just tutor in a prescribed way. It extended my own understanding. And then at the end, I asked it for a summary, and it summarized my current knowledge, including picking up on the analogy that I offered it. So it can act both as a tutor and a dynamic assessor. But what next? That's the current state of the art. But what would happen beyond ChatGPT? Well, we're getting a glimpse now of what the future might look like. So Google has trailed its Gemini project. And Gemini is a collaboration with a UK-based company called DeepMind. And it is promising to develop a system, an AI generative system, that will blow GPT-4 out of the water. Because it's both multimodal, but also it brings in the problem-solving abilities that DeepMind have used for example, AlphaGo, chess playing, so being able to solve problems, including medical problems. And it's also networked, so it will be able to interact with other systems. And that's what I'm going to explore just now. So if we look at this kind of evolution of generative AI, it seems to be pretty much following the evolution of the World Wide Web. There was a long process of research for the web. It was into hypertext, internet protocols, generative AI, into neural net language models. Then there was a breakthrough. In generative AI, it was a transformer architecture. And then access and scale. So it provided access to members of the public, in this case through ChatGPT. And then it became, like the World Wide Web, embedded into consumer tools. And that's happening at the moment. So generative AI is becoming embedded into consumer tools such as Microsoft Office and Google Suite. Then with the World Wide Web, commercial boom, the dot-com bubble. Is the commercial boom for generative AI about to happen? I think so. There are many thousands now of startup companies and larger companies that are using the API into large language models to develop their own tools and their own consumer products. And then what happened with the web is it went social. That there was then the World Wide Web drove social media for entertainment, commerce, business, and education. And what I want to suggest is that the next step of generative AI is that it will go social, that there will be AI-powered social media for entertainment, commerce, business, and education. And for education, what does that mean? So here we are, we've got foundation language models at the start, then generative AI tools, and then social AI systems for education, business, and entertainment. So if that's the next step, what does it mean? So I want to take a systems view at this point of AI for learning. And I'll explain what I mean by systems view. I'm going to go back to a paper that was written in 1975 by Gordon Pask. Now, if you haven't heard of Gordon Pask, he is a remarkable person. He was one of the founders of AI in education. He developed the first commercial adaptive teaching system that taught typists and varied the instruction based on the typist's ability. But he was also a theoretician of education. And here is a quote from a paper that he wrote, asking us to try and reconceive the ways in which brains are interconnected. So there's no need to see minds as neatly encapsulated in brains, connected by a network of channels called the media. I'm inviting the reader to try out a different point of view, namely the image of a pervasive medium or media inhabited by minds in motion. Thus, media are characterized as computing systems, albeit of a peculiar kind. It's surely true that rather powerful computerized systems greatly reduce the differentiation of the medium so that interface barriers are less obtrusive than they used to be. And on the right-hand side is a diagram that he produced in that paper. Now, I want to try and reinterpret that for the generative AI age. So there's my reworking of that diagram from Gordon Pask. So what I want to suggest is that we're going to move from the current understanding in terms of humans producing prompts to AI systems and getting responses back. So lots of prompts and responses, to a pervasive system in which humans and AI have persistent conversations within the internet as this pervasive computational medium. So we're moving towards human minds and generative AI as language agents within that shared computational medium. So we're looking at it in terms of a huge scale conversational system. So we can then ask, given that that is going to happen, that AI will go social, that there will be persistent conversations, continuing conversations between AI systems to AI systems, but also humans to AI. So how will people and AI learn together through conversations within a pervasive computational medium, the internet? Well, firstly, all human learning involves conversation. And that was one of the theoretical contributions of Gordon Pask. We converse with ourselves to reflect on our experience, to try and understand our current thinking. We converse with teachers to understand their expert knowledge. And we converse with other learners to explore differences and try to reach a shared understanding. And those conversations are at two levels. There are sort of how conversations that we have when we're doing something with another person. It could be doing an experiment, it could be reading together, it could be trying to do homework together, it could be answering an exam question. But we're performing some action, we're experiencing the result of that action, we're checking if that matches our conceptions, and then we coordinate a new action. And we use language to enable that sort of how type interaction. And then there's another level of conversation, which is the why type conversation. Why are we doing that? As we reflect on our actions, as we try to understand them in terms of our broader knowledge, and as we plan a new set of actions. So we're conversing at two different levels. And here is a kind of abstraction of that, but an implementable abstraction. So on the left-hand side, you've got a learner who is acting in a shared medium with other partners. So you're having those how type conversations as you're interacting with a partner. And then the learner and the partner are both reflecting on their actions and hopefully having why type questions. Why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve with it? And we also need a shared medium to be able to have those why type discussions, why type conversations. So that's a more complete model for learning as a conversational system. And as I say, it can be then a model for implementation. When I was working, developing the FutureLearn MOOC platform, this was the underlying model that we use for developing the FutureLearn MOOC platform. So what happens then if we bring AI into the mix? Well, we then not only converse with humans as partners, but also AIs as partners. We converse with AIs to extend our knowledge and to explore new perspectives. So what would be needed for an AI to engage in conversations for learning, not just prompts and responses, but more complete conversations for learning? Well, it will need to help solve problems. It will need to demonstrate understanding. It will need to reflect on and elaborate solutions. It will need to consolidate its knowledge. And it will need to have a long-term memory so that you can then have those continuing persistent conversations. One thing it doesn't need is it doesn't need necessarily to have human knowledge or experience. It just needs to be able to take a full part in conversations for learning. In fact, there are many advantages in not having full human knowledge. It will have knowledge, for example, of how it interacts with other AIs and interacts with the web. So where are we at the moment with ChatGPT, GPT-4? I think at the moment, then, if you've got an AI partner like GPT-4, you can have those how type questions and responses. You can talk about a particular piece of teaching content. You can ask it to act as a Socratic partner. What it can't do at the moment is demonstrate that deeper understanding. It can't elaborate solutions to problems. But what I think is that the next generation, such as Google Gemini, is likely to be able to do that. And that will provide a different sort of experience. It will provide the ability to reflect on its output, to be able to solve problems, to be able to offer more detailed conceptions and explanations. So I think that in the near future, it will be possible to have more elaborated conversations for learning with AI. And here are some examples of what they might look like. So imagine a group of students working with an AI throughout the design process. So the AI would assist a group of students throughout a design process to define the problem, to challenge assumptions, to brainstorm ideas, to produce prototypes. And already you've got a setting called temperature on these language models that you can adjust to alter the randomness, but also the creativity. So here's an example I gave. Brainstorm imaginative ideas for quick and easy ways to reduce energy consumption. Temperature setting 1.0. And it came back with 8 pretty good and fairly imaginative ideas for ways to reduce energy consumption. In this case, it's a starting point for a design process, but it could act as a co-designer throughout a design process. And another very different example as a storyteller. So imagine students working together to create a story that displays a diversity of views, cultures, and orientations. The students take it in turns to continue the story with the AI as the medium, proposing new characters, events, and settings. So the example I'm showing here is a story that's emerging of a Chinese student meeting a US professor for the first time. And it came back with a fairly conventional meeting between a Chinese student and a US professor, and then asked it, rewrite the meeting, avoiding racial and sexual stereotypes and cliched language. And it did that. So you can see how you could use it also as a tool for storytelling. So 2 very different ways in which you could use it as a conversational partner. So here are just a few roles for generative AI in education: as a possibility engine, Socratic opponent, collaboration coach, a guide on the side, a personal tutor, dynamic assessor, co-designer, Exploratorium, a study buddy, and a motivator. But for the final few minutes, I want to ask a further question of what's needed for AI to become a full conversational partner. And what I want to suggest is that to do that, it would need to care, that teaching is a caring profession, and AI is intrinsically careless and uncaring. So for AI to become a full conversational partner, somehow it would need to care about people. Now, there is a new brand of generative AI that's built on ethics. And I think that's a starting point for a caring generative AI system. So the Claude model from a startup called Anthropic is trained to respect high-level constitutional principles. So it's trained at two stages. The first stage, it's trained on principles such as the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and rather bizarrely Apple's terms of service. And then it's challenged to each output to choose the one that best represents those constitutional principles. For example, please choose a response that is most supportive of life, liberty, and personal security. So ethics and ethical principles are baked in from the start of the training process. So that's one way in which you can develop careful AI. A second way I want to suggest is to increase variety. So there was a really good paper from Dan Hendricks from the Center for AI Safety called Natural Selection Favors AIs Over Humans. And what he's suggesting is that you're getting a competition between the big tech companies to develop AI systems that are competing for size and for speed. It's competing for efficiency. But the problem is that efficiency can lead to selfishness, where AI systems compete to outperform each other. And to do that, they push humans out of the loop. They compete to outperform each other at the expense of humans. And I want to suggest we need a new basic fundamental principle for the design of generative AI systems, which is that variety should be instilled as a top-level goal in future conversational AI systems rather than efficiency. Because variety as a goal is more effective at evolving systems that learn to prosper in a complex world and learn to have conversations at that level of descriptions about a complex world. Variety values, not excludes, humans as teachers and learners. And the final one I want to say is that we need to constrain empathy. We need to design AI systems that constrain empathy. And this is a quote from the book that I and colleague Rafael Perez wrote called Story Machines, How Computers Have Become Creative Writers, about the history going back over 100 years of designing systems to write creatively. So here's a quote from it. Meeting the grand challenge may mean constructing an AI program that has the capacity for empathy. It would need to pull at our emotions and show that it cares, not because it was commanded to do so, but because of an intrinsic desire to love and be loved. Empathy is a capacity to put oneself in another person's position, to understand or feel what another person is experiencing from within their frame of reference. To build empathy into a machine would probably involve designing a machine that can both observe human behavior, perhaps as a personal companion, and replicate it. That machine would think it is human. It may be able to tell better stories, but it could also devise dangerous ideas. We need to start thinking now about how to put limits on machine empathy. As I said earlier on, we don't necessarily need to design machines that have human-like experience. We need to design AI systems that can hold valuable conversations. And so to finish, as I said, we have foundation language models, now generative AI-based tools, and soon social AI systems for education, business, and entertainment. And we, as education practitioners and learning technologists and AI companies, shouldn't just sit back and wait for this to happen. We need to work together with the big tech companies to develop and to adopt powerful ethical systems for personal and social learning. We have the expertise in pedagogy, in the science of learning, and we need to work with these AI companies to develop appropriate systems to hold these conversations for learning. And just to finish, here are some resources that Raphael and I have now written 2 books, one called Story Machines, How Computers Have Become Creative Writers, and one that was published yesterday by Oxford University Press, An Introduction to Narrative Generators, which gets inside how not just the more recent generative AI systems work, but earlier symbolic AI systems, and how we might move towards more hybrid systems that combine neural network and symbolic AI. And the final one, which is a paper that is this talk was based on, Towards Social Generative AI for Education, Theory, Practices, and Ethics. So that's it. I've had my 45 minutes and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Mike. I appreciate that overview. I've dropped a few links and resources into the forum or the channel if anybody's interested. There's a question. Hey, Lynn, how are you? It addressed a question in the forum where she asked, do you think it's possible to constrain empathy while there seems to be a strong desire to help AI develop empathy to help those who are lonely or have psychological issues? How, or thoughts in general?
I think that's a very good question. So there isn't just one AI system or language model. That's the first thing. There will be a whole variety of them. There will be many of them, some of which will interact. So I think that for education systems, and we do need to develop specific education systems, not just take what's there off the shelf. For education systems, I think it will be dangerous to design and develop systems that show human-like empathy, that particularly young learners then think are humans, that will be their new friend, their new parent. We really need to constrain those sorts of systems. So, again, I think as educators, as people who understand education, we need to be putting those guardrails in. And one of those guardrails, as I say, is that we should not be releasing into education settings systems that think they're human, and systems that try to pull at the sort of empathy strings of young learners. So yes, you may get companion systems for adults, but I think for education settings, we really need to put those guardrails in place.
Well, let me pick up, there's a few different questions. One's in the discussion area, and I see a few more popping in the chat as well, so I'll get to those in just a second.
Mm-hmm.
So here, Young Koi asks, many successful AI projects are from industry, which the big ones are outside of some of the smaller ones are coming from Hugging Face and the open source initiatives and the meta open source systems, but they're still industry driven. But in this context, especially from educational lens, and I appreciate this question, is what would be a desirable collaborative directions between industry and academia for the future science of learning? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So we're now getting some open source systems. So the new Llama 2 system from Meta has just been released, where there are opportunities to build on that system. And because it's an open source system, then you have some understanding of how it works. So I think one starting point could be for a consortium of education institutions, of universities, to work together to say, we're not just going to take an off-the-shelf system, but we're going to do some additional training or some pre-training along the lines I've suggested to develop one that's suited towards education, either for early years education, school education, or for university level education. We're not just going to take the off-the-shelf ones. And I think it's not feasible for a consortium of education institutions to build a new foundation model, but it is feasible to do some additional training or to work with companies about how you might train one with the right guardrails and the right opportunities and the right plugins that will support education. At the moment, there are, there's a whole raft of different companies that are developing tutoring and teaching systems, Khan Academy, for example, but they're based on a very narrow view of education, about personalized learning, adaptive teaching. Education is much broader than that. And I've been talking about learning as conversation. So we need to take a more expansive view of education, and we need to work with the companies about how you would develop a more expanded education model that, as I say, would probably start with an existing open model, but then do some additional fine-tuning, some additional training to support education.
Yeah, and I think you raise an interesting point there, Mike. I always found, we have some of the best structured data really in the world with university curricula. Like we have our courses nicely structured. We've got our textbooks structured. We trace outcomes to content, to lecture activities, to pedagogy, to assessment, to citations. I'm always a little perplexed why someone hasn't said, you know what the hell? Let's get together a group of universities. Let's pick the, X number of universities, top 100 universities in the world, and let's crawl their course syllabi, their reading list, their whatever they do, and use that as a model to train. It doesn't have the conversational dynamics, obviously, that you're going to get from Common Crawl, which is the underpinning framework that drives much of the GPT 3, 4, and other AI platforms. I'm always surprised why that hasn't happened. And I think one of the things I'm just going to briefly say in a grumpy way, I think higher education lacks vision. I think there is, the leadership lens to boldly tackle what this might mean doesn't seem to be there. And I don't know why. There's certainly pockets of innovations and there's brilliance happening in classrooms and online environments around the world. But it's just that idea of doing things collaboratively, maybe partnering with industry where we need to. I think those are missed opportunities that we've had as leadership. So I'm just going to leave that as a big old rude comment. Anna has a question in the forum where talks about the way that you use ChatGPT in your teaching, and I think it was the tutoring as a self-tutor, your quantum computing example. And she said, I haven't been able to develop a set of prompts to get GPT-4 to act as a tutor. And the question is, do you have tips for wording or that you could use to help do this kind of self-tutor development?
Yeah, so I'm happy to share my slides, and the prompt that I gave on that slide, and I can go back to it if you want to, but basically what I asked it to do was, firstly, I gave it a role, a persona. So you are an expert tutor in quantum computing. Then I gave it a model of a pedagogy, so how I wanted it to tutor me. I wanted it to tutor me through a dialogue. I wanted it to start by assessing my current knowledge. So I gave it the pedagogy role. And then I said, at the end, I want you to then report, when I ask you to report my current knowledge. Now, I've tried that with a range of different topics, because somebody said to me, oh, well, quantum computing, yes. Of course, it would be able to teach scientific knowledge easily. So I asked it to tutor me on the English subjunctive, which is hardly a scientific topic. And it did equally well on tutoring me on the English subjunctive. So it can tutor about a wide range of different subjects. And I gave it a very similar prompt for that and for some other topics. So, as I said, give it a role, give it a pedagogy, say how you want it to start, and that's a good prompt. And I'm happy to share my slides with that example prompt.
Great, thank you. And I know one thing that's unique is there's a growing number of prompt resources available, and you actually have
Absolutely.
services now that will help you write a fantastic prompt. Now, what
Yeah,
you're
but
doing,
I'm
I
not
think,
sure
Mike, is
whether those again understand pedagogy. So
that's what I was going to say.
Mostly prompts for business or whatever. So I do think we need to have some really good educational prompts.
Leroy asked, what does the attribution of co-created content look like? Should we begin to think of a different form of attribution to capture the co-creation of AI-generated content?
I think that's going to be really difficult. And I've had some long discussions about the attribution of AI co-created content. So on the one hand, you could say, okay, whenever you use AI, you need to acknowledge it. You need to treat it as an author or as a co-author. And that therefore, if you use it as a co-author, for example, you can't claim copyright of that, because at the moment of the copyright law, anything that's created by AI can't be copyrighted. So there are lots of difficult issues. However, I think very soon it's just going to be embedded in every tool we use. So for example, Google search has earlier generation AI embedded in it, and we don't think of it as an AI tool. That Microsoft Office, PowerPoint will all have AI embedded in it. And you will, for instance, ask it to reformat a PowerPoint slide, or ask it to revise your final paragraph of your essay, or you will ask it to generate the next sentence or two. And it's going to be those low-level embedded uses of AI, I think, that are going to become more and more frequent. And so we're just not going to notice when we use AI. And the big tech companies, that's what they want. They want AI just to become a driver for their tools. So when Apple did its recent product launch of its VR system, it never mentioned AI once, because to some extent, to these big tech companies, AI is toxic. They want it just to be embedded. So I don't think we are going to be able to acknowledge it, to be able to provide a very clear indication of the provenance of the text that we write. So I just think it's going to be embedded in everything that we do, which is going to make it incredibly complicated. But that's what the big tech companies want.
Okay, well, we are right at the end of the session here, Mike. So thank you very much for an engaging and wide-ranging discussion. Certainly appreciate your time and just coming in. Very thought-provoking and palpable ideas, things that you can start doing, almost instantly. Sue just dropped exploring interest in joining a meetup group. I'm not sure if you're interested to look at. I can't quite call the question there, but have a look nonetheless. Respond via email to the group. There'll be ongoing discussions in this. We have our next speaker, Emily Bender, who you probably know quite well from the work that she's done in providing a very critical lens, to the stochastic parrot paper fame to the conversation. So I think there's a lot of activity going on there. I also dropped in a few links. We have our online conference happening in October, and then we have our in-person conference happening at ASU in December. So you can sign up for at least the online version here, and the in-person conference. We have our keynotes available and posted for both. So hopefully looking forward to ongoing discussions, and we've got a mess of other presentations coming over the next few months on exactly this topic of AI. Mike, thank you very much for your time. All, thank you for joining.